Good afternoon or morning, depending on when you are listening to this. This is the Raw Podcast brought to you by the Sunderland Echo. I'm your host for today, James Copley. I'm joined by my colleague, Phil Smith. Phil, how are you feeling? Pumped full of coffee yesterday? I'd imagine a pretty long shift for you.
Yeah, it was. It was weird. I'm really tired, but then obviously not actually that much happened, so I don't feel like I don't feel entitled to be as tired as I am. But yeah, I have more coffee and I'm good to go. So let's get into it.
Yeah, indeed. I think there's only one place to start recently. You've written a brilliant piece on the Sunderland Echo website, which I would encourage listeners to go and read on Sunderland's January as a whole. I think, Phil, the striker situation is dominating the discourse and the narrative, and that obviously needs to be talked about. But what are your thoughts of Sunderland's window as a whole, including that big striker question which has come along at the end of it?
Yeah, I think I think that piece I've written is trying to sort of make sense of the kind of mixed emotions. I think because are Sunderland stronger now than they went into the January window? I don't think you can say they are. Therefore, it means it's probably an unsuccessful window. But that seems quite reductive because, you know, some of the things that have gone against them this month, the Stewart injury, the Evans injury, the Sims recall, that's significant mitigating factors. And also the fact that they've signed some really exciting players. Pierre Ekwar came on at Fulham incredibly, his first ever professional appearance, and really got stuck in and looked quite good. And so I don't doubt that they've added some really exciting talent, and I feel really positive about the trajectory of this squad and where the club's going. But I think that the squad is probably in a slightly weaker position than it went into the window because of those injuries and because of those loan situations, which is part bad luck, but obviously you've got to prepare for these kind of eventualities as well. So I think, like everybody, I'm still trying to sort of piece it all together and pick my way through it at the moment. But I think yesterday was a disappointment. I think and that's absolutely no slight on Joe Anderson, who, fingers crossed, will have an excellent Sunderland career. But I think to not get that sort of experience and that little bit of depth that Tony Mowbray was talking about on Saturday, I think it has to go down as a disappointing end.
I think you touched upon it there. In terms of analysing this, there's a lot of facets. There's the bad luck to lose Ross Stewart to injury when you've just brought Joe Geldhart in. Everton being a shambles in the Sims situation isn't a situation of Sunderland's making. However, the flip side of that is Sunderland have known about this problem for a year now, and Sunderland's last purchase of a permanent striker was Ross Stewart, which I think is 3 windows ago now. The other flip side to that is, we're flipping all over the place here, Phil, is that strikers are a premium. It's a premium position. It's easy to get your eyes taken out in January. We've seen that the club don't want to rush into things, make the same mistakes that have been made at the club in the past, the likes of Will Grigg and whatnot. So there's lots going on in the analysis, but the cold, hard fact of the matter is that Sunderland going to this FA Cup tie against Fulham after the Millwall game, and they won't be able to field a senior striker because Geldhart's cup tied, which is a problem.
Yeah, it's not really good enough, is it? Like, I think that's okay to say, and I think we can praise I think probably where a lot of the mixed emotions for us come from is that obviously, when we were doing these pods years ago, and I was writing for years about wanting to see a proper structure at the football club, wanting to see an identity, and I'm going to Fulham on Saturday, and I'm seeing this vibrant young team with technical quality that I didn't think was possible 3 years ago, and I'm watching them slug it out against a proper Premier League team and go toe to toe, and it's thrilling and it's fantastic, and I'm absolutely loving it. And so I feel like that's kind of, when we get into these decisions, that's the context, isn't it? That this is a club that seems to be very strongly on the up. And if you look at Geldhart, he had the pick of the Championship clubs. He's one of the most exciting young strikers in the country. And he's come to Sunderland because he's watched them on the telly and he sees how good they are, and he's spoken to the manager and he believes in the development plan. And that's fantastic, and it's a real positive. But it's not good enough for a club to be going into a big FA Cup tie without a striker, to be dependent on a player whose match fitness probably isn't at the absolute top level at the moment, to go into a month where there's about 8 fixtures, I think. it's disappointing, and clearly there's aspects of the process, if you like, that need to be improved. Because for all the Stewart injury is rotten luck, and for all the Sims recall was pretty baffling on Everton's part. We knew going into this window that Sunderland would only have one striker contracted for next season, so you would have thought it was an area they were looking at, and it was an area they were looking at. I know for a fact that they strike permanent deals for young strikers. I think people fairly widely reported. I think that Andras Nemeth was, one player that they looked at and had talks with. In the end, he goes to a Hamburg team. It could be in the Bundesliga next year. That sort of thing sometimes happens, So I still feel, quite optimistic about where this team's going. But, we will see, I think, an impact on results because of the squad balance between now and the end of the season, I think. And, that is a real shame.
Well, you look at I think it was 7-8 games where Sunderland didn't have a striker. You had the 2 0-0 draws at the Stadium of Light against Preston and Blackpool. And I think in that run of 7-8, there were some decent results and some decent fight backs, but Sunderland actually only won the one game against Wigan Athletic, which is a shame given how well Tony Mowbray, I thought, coped. You mentioned as well, Phil, but I guess the frustration with the striker situation, and you did touch upon it a little bit, comes that all over the pitch and all over the club, with the exception of maybe the goalkeeping situation, where you could argue that Sunderland are one injury away from having to play Alex Bass, and then behind him there's not really too much. But everywhere else on the pitch, there is this, succession planning with young, vibrant players. Obviously, there's the experience argument as well, which we'll come on to, but it's literally just the striker situation. And I think when you put it in terms of the context of the season as well, we've played everybody now, we've seen what the division's about, we have this team that Sunderland fans rightly think can compete, playing under a decent manager. It's hugely frustrating that sort of playoff push probably won't be there, as you alluded to, because of the striker issue. I think that frustration is completely understandable from Sunderland fans. I really do, for all the good work that's gone on.
Yeah, it's totally understandable, and it's one that we've got to be sort of careful with, I guess, because at the start of the season we were all saying that 18th would be an okay season.
100%.
If Sunderland go on and finish the season in 10th, it's been an outstanding season. It'll be the best season a team promoted out of League One has produced for years, and they'll have done it with a young squad playing really good football. And that would be a genuinely fantastic season and a platform to kick on. And yet, we are watching the games every week, and we know that Sunderland can compete with everyone. We're seeing what Ahmad and Roberts are doing. We see the level that Dan Neil's at. We know the situation is not ideal. I mean, I was in a press conference with Tony Mowbray on Saturday, and he said, listen, and he was really optimistic about where the team's going, and he wasn't sort of banging his fist making demands, but he made pretty clear that this is an incredibly young team, and we need some help in terms of bodies. Otherwise, it's going to be really difficult for us to sustain what they're doing. I'm never ever going to sit here and criticise them not sort of breaking the bank and ripping up structures to go and get a striker for 6 months or whatever, because I don't think it's the right thing to do, and we've seen the quite ruinous consequences of that in the past. But I think, like you say, even if we account for the fact that there have been some scarcely credible sort of events that have gone on to come out of 2 windows really without the adequate striking options is pretty poor. I think that has to be a cause for reflection, even if the general sort of trend of what's going on is pretty good.
As always happens with this sort of stuff, when a squad have a position that needs filling after the deadline, you sort of look at the free agent market, you start trawling lists of players, Mexicans and 32-year-old Germans and Russians and all of this sort of stuff. From what we know about the club and how they operate, Phil, I can't see that as a market that they would explore. Do you agree or disagree? How do you see that question?
I would be really surprised if they did. I mean, they will definitely look. They looked in after the summer window when we were having similar conversations, because it's their responsibility to be thorough. I have to say that I don't think there's anything in terms of what they've done so far and what they've said that would suggest that they wouldn't take an older player on a short-term contract if it suited the team. I don't think they would have any problems whatsoever, going out and bringing someone in for 6 months on a decent contract if they felt that was going to improve the team. They just wouldn't want to be tied to a long-term contract, in terms of paying a fee or or being left with a player who they're clearly not going to use in 18 months' time still on the books. So I don't think they'd be against doing a short-term deal. But I know for a fact that they would only do it if they felt that it was a really good player. Are those options out there? I have absolutely no idea. I suspect they're not, because strikers are a premium, and it's very rare to have good players out of contract.
Well, I had a little look today, and the options are really, really scarce. The only one that I could see really that even Sunderland fans would want would maybe be Chris Martin, because he's just left Bristol City. He's got loads of championship experience. I think he's only 33, but the rest of them, you're looking at like a 35-year-old Kyle Lafferty, Connor Wickham, who's been down a couple of divisions as a free agent. He's like 31, 32. Fraser Campbell's probably one who's played in the championship most recently, but he's about 34. So the type of player it's not really there, I don't think, Phil.
I don't think so. I think Chris Martin's a decent player. I've seen him having a lot of good games. I don't know where he's at in terms of his fitness is the question. And also for him, would he want to come for a few months?
Well, he rejected us about 5 years ago.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. But I mean, my point is, is he leaving Bristol City? I assume he'd probably be looking to try and get at least 18 months somewhere. You know what I mean? It's a big time in his career. Yeah. So yeah, that's just being hypothetical, but I think it's highly unlikely at this stage. I think the likely scenario is that they'll try and go with what they've got.
Yeah, I want to talk about the two deals that did happen on deadline day. Joe Anderson coming in from Everton, I think 3.5-year deal, central defender. That meant that Bailey Wright went out, 30-year-old, on loan to Rotherham. I think on the face of that, Phil, it's not something I mind. Bailey Wright wants to play. That's fine. I think he should be afforded that opportunity. He doesn't owe Sunderland anything. He's been a good servant. And then it makes sense to get a player in who you can build up and potentially sell on, a younger player who fits the profile of the club. However, I think with the injuries now to Corey Evans and Ross Stewart, who were two of Sunderland's more experienced players, Evans certainly, just wonder whether letting somebody like Wright go is the right decision, and because Pritchard isn't quite back yet, and in terms of experience, the well is pretty dry at the moment. You got Danny Barth in there, and Gooch has been in and out the side. Luke O'Nien doesn't have a great deal of championship experience, even though he's 27, 28, and you can't keep players at the club against their will and keep them around just because they're good to have. But I just wonder if that might be a little bit of a mistake. Obviously, we won't know how it turns out for a while. Yeah. But
I can't really have any qualms with that decision. I mean, I do think the squad looks a little bit on the inexperienced side. I'm not sure the balance is quite there. But having said that, I don't think we would see Bart and Wright in the same team very often, if ever. I think we've seen, and not just Tony Mowbray, Alex Neil was the same. Generally speaking, unless there haven't been other options, they've gone with one or the other, because I think being in the Championship requires a level of speed and athleticism in your defence that I think is quite difficult if you play Bart and Wright, both of whom I think have still got Championship qualities, but it's certainly not pace, is it, or speed. And I just don't think you can ask Bailey Wright to basically be good in the changing rooms and not play. If you watched his sort of interview with Rotherham, you could sort of see that he was like, I'm 30. I'm not like, I've still got football to play. And, clearly he's not comfortable with the idea of just basically being there as a sort of a support, if you like. And I think that's fair enough
as well.
Yeah. And I just don't think you can ask a player of his, when you've got so much respect for a player who's given so much to the club, has had such an important role in its recent past. I just don't think you can. I think they've done the right thing by him and therefore by the club. And I think it's important that when you have players who give you that level of service, that you treat them with respect and you don't stand in the way when it's time for them to move on. I think that's an important part of what you try to sell to players you bring in as well. That you make clear that when whatever reason, if they outgrow you or you outgrow them, you give them the chance to go and play. So I totally get the experience argument, and I think it is a little bit of a concern. But I would slightly check that against the fact that I don't think Wright and Bart would ever be on the pitch that much together, if ever, which means that you're not really losing anything in terms of your on-the-pitch leadership. I think probably the bigger error or the more concerning thing is that you haven't got that experienced holding midfielder who could potentially play sometimes in front of Bart, and then all of a sudden you are adding that experience to your spine. So I can understand the question totally, but I just think it's the right decision. I think it's the right way to treat someone who I think all of us would agree showed the utmost sort of respect and professionalism for the badge in the time he was here. And I think if you do that, I think you deserve to leave sort of on your own terms and make your own decisions. And I think they've absolutely done the right thing there.
Indeed, one of Sunderland's better players in League One through some pretty dark times, no doubt about it. Started at Sunderland, started for Sunderland at Wembley against Wickham Wanderers in the playoff final. I want to talk quickly, Phil, about Corey Evans. Obviously, the club have rightly been criticised for some of the decisions in January, namely the striker decision, but the way they're operating in terms of how they've handled the right situation, but how it looks like they're going to handle the Evans situation as well. Obviously, he's out with a long-term injury to his knee. Reports suggest that Sunderland are going to stick by Corey Evans and keep him at the club. He's got 6 months left on his deal with the option. Tony Mowbray has talked about doing the right thing by him. That's good to hear from my point of view, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And you'd expect him to stand by him, even if there wasn't a prospect of him sort of coming back and making an impact. But to be honest, I don't think we're at that stage yet. I still think Corey Evans has got plenty of football left. An ACL is a really bad injury, but if you're telling me he'll come back later this year, all right, he's unlikely to come back in and be a total regular, but as a squad option, he's clearly still championship quality to me from what we've seen this year. So I don't see any reason why he can't come back and be a useful squad player and make an impact around these talented young midfielders. So I agree with you. It's the right thing to do to stand by him, but I just don't see it as the end for Corey Evans, really, to be honest. I still think he's got something to give, and I think someone's decision will be a reflection of that, as well as their respect for what he's done in recent times as well.
No, absolutely. We'll talk about that midfield actually now and squad depth. You produced a lovely little graphic which you can find on Phil's Twitter. I'll run through it quickly, which is excellent, Phil, that you've essentially done the work for this podcast for me. But we've got Anthony Patterson in goal with Alex Bass. Centre-back options, you've got Bart, Agialisi, Anderson, Ballard and Luke O'Nien. Right-back, you've got Gooch and Trey Hume. Left-back, Cirque and Huggins, but Agialisi can also play there. Centre midfield, Dan Neil, Pierre Ekwa, January signing, obviously. Also got Mishu and Barr, who can play centre midfield. Number 10 spots, you've got Ahmad, Pritchard. Roberts could play there as well, in theory. Right wing, Roberts again. New signing, Laharge. Left, you've got Clark and Bennett. And up front, you've obviously just got poor old Joe Geldhart at the moment, with maybe an under-21 player behind him if they decided to go down that road. Phil, if you chop the last part of that graphic off the striker bit, the rest of it actually on paper, without having seen some of the new lads play yet, doesn't look too bad.
No, it doesn't. I think it's an exciting squad. I think it's a talented squad. The only concern you'd have is one that Mowbray raised last week, really, which is that you don't have that holding midfielder, really. Dan Neil's done exceptionally well there in recent weeks, and I don't have any issues with him sort of continuing there, because I think his level's been superb. But obviously, it's back to again, we're talking about 18 games and sort of asking Neil to play every one. It doesn't look to me like Pierre was a holding midfielder. It looks to me like he wants to press. It looks to me like he wants to drive forward. He wants to try and get on the end of stuff in sort of around the box. Barr is effectively being used more as a 10 than a centre midfielder, and that's looked a really good place for him. So I have a bit of a concern there, because I think while you've got an incredibly talented midfield that I thoroughly enjoy watching, I think the balance isn't quite right, and I have a little bit of a concern there. But otherwise, I think it looks pretty strong, certainly in defence. Again, it's that contrast between, to me, like, I think it's by and large a really good squad that's going to play good football and it's going to finish well clear of the relegation zone, and that's a good season. But I guess it's just that because the results and the performances have been so encouraging of late, we've slightly changed our perceptions and our expectations. And that sort of makes us look at some of these positions a little bit differently, I guess.
Yeah, on that question of expectation and maybe looking forward a little bit to next season, Tony Mowbray has spoken before about, in the second half of the season, getting some of these players like Abdullah Barr, like 10, 15 games. Obviously, Mishoot's starting to play a bit more now. You got Laharge and Bennett who will possibly play a greater part in the second half of Sunderland's season. Is there an argument to suggest that this season was maybe all about championship survival, cementing our spot, blooding these youngsters, getting them up to speed, getting them involved in English football, giving them a taste of what it's like, and then in the next the next year after, the next 2-3 years, that's when Sunderland really hit the stride. Maybe I'm just big picturing things a little too much here.
No, I think that's definitely right. I think if at the start of the season you said to Sunderland, you first half of the season will be a bit tricky at times, but you'll get clear of relegation, and then the last few months of the season you can start to increase. Bar, Mishu, Bennett can start to feature a bit more. Their language skills will have improved by then. They'll be a bit more settled. You'll finish comfortably, and then they'll be ready to sort of hit the ground running in pre-season. I think that would have been the perfect scenario. And it still is an excellent scenario. It's still a pretty good outcome. But sometimes, obviously, you see what's in front of you as well, which is, before Stuart went down at Fulham, there was a chance for something a little bit more. I don't think that's been unrealistic or unfair. I think that's a fair judgment based on the rest of the division. And, I say that whilst acknowledging that the top two's gone and that, you have teams with bigger budget and more experience, deeper squads that have been at this level for a long time, who I still think will finish above Sunderland, Middlesbrough, West Brom, potentially Norwich, potentially Watford. And so you could finish 7th and you finish behind those 6 teams and you just go, well, okay, fair enough. Their budget's huge, their experience is huge. But there was certainly a chance to be in the mix, I think, which is probably gone. And I think that's a shame, while maintaining that context of what you said, that I think the plan was always for a season of consolidation where these players could drop in and out. And we're beginning to see with Mishu, for example, who, if Sunderland were to trigger his clause, and some of that would be a big investment, but they'd be doing so, hopefully having him had sort of 6 months of impressing in the second half of the season. So I think that is the context. I think you're absolutely right that I don't think anything in the plan has particularly gone wrong. We just had a sort of a sniff, didn't we, of like, oh my God, could this be on? I think that's been taken away a bit, and there's obviously a disappointment that comes with that.
But I think that impatience, because I feel it myself, I really do. That impatience by the fan base is actually entirely understandable when you frame this season in the context of being in League One for 4 years, a championship season before that, which was a disaster, and a Premier League season before that, which was an absolute disaster. We're all so thirsty and hungry for success. We know what a bad team looks like, and this isn't a bad team. This team could achieve things, and I think that's where it gets a lot of fans, where it's just we're so close. And yes, you want to see long-term strategies and long-term plans, and I'm all for that as well. I'd be hypocritical to say, well, get that all in the bin and let's go for promotion this season. But it does feel like it's close and could be close at some point.
Yeah, definitely, and we all want it now, and that's just a totally sort of natural human impulse. That's what football is for, and you want that joy here and now. And listen, I don't feel particularly sort of downbeat or pessimistic about where this club's headed in any way, shape or form, and not just off the back of yesterday. I think there's a chance for Sunderland still potentially to finish in the top half of the Championship, which would be an outstanding return. And you'd have to say that would be largely due to, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we had a lot of debates, interesting debates last year about how Sunderland and Wigan had done it. Wigan, who invested a lot of money in quite long contracts on League One proven players. Sunderland gambled on young players who they felt would be more comfortable making the step up to the Championship. Wigan absolutely walked that division, really, and did outstandingly well. Sunderland came very close to not getting out that division because of some of the experiences. But what we've seen this season is that recruitment strategy has allowed Sunderland to adapt to the division so much more easily than Wigan, for example. And that's the context, isn't it? That the same strategy that we're sort of bemoaning in slight areas is the reason why, in a fairly short space of time, so much progress has been made. And to be fair, I think most people acknowledge that. I think most people are broadly supportive of what's happening and what's been done. And I think that by and large, I think we can have some confidence that Sunderland will be stronger next season. In terms of, some of these players will be settled. I'm sure they'll find some new players to add to the group. It is exciting times. But I think it's fair to wonder how, like we said, we can come out of 2 windows where the most obvious kind of concern, if you like, hasn't been addressed.
It's a funny old business. Perception is a funny old thing in football. If Geldhart does extremely well against Millwall, Laharge shows something really good, and Ekwa shows something really good, then suddenly everybody's excited about that, and the problems perhaps melt away a little bit. I'm not saying they go away entirely, but football seems to hinge on these little narratives. We'll see how it works out. This podcast is coming to you live on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. It will be available in all podcast places later. Just want to run through a couple of things and say hello to Mike Jason, who is on Facebook, Paul Richardson as well. Anthem Mackham is commenting on YouTube. Stephen Junior Clark on Facebook as well makes the point that if someone said Sunderland would be in the top 10 of this stage at the season, I wouldn't believe them. I think that's entirely fair. We'll move on, Phil, very quickly. Just do a little Millwall preview. Interesting game down at the Den. Don't know too much of Tony Mowbray's thoughts yet because due to speak to him tomorrow in terms of injuries and whatnot. But a game Sunderland could be targeting as a potential win. What would you expect in terms of lineup? Very similar, just without Stewart and Evans.
Yeah, very similar, I think. I honestly think this is about as hard as it gets in the Championship, to be honest. You know, Millwall are right up there in the playoff. Millwall are right up there in the playoff places, and that's pretty mainly centred around the fact that they're unbelievably difficult to beat at home. And I think that one of the things that we're sort of back to, which we talked about a lot earlier in the season, is that without Stewart and Sims, you know, there is a lack of height and physicality in that team, I think. And I think asking aside this inexperienced and without that huge physical stature to go and take on Millwall at the Den, I have to say I think that's a pretty tall order. That's not me being pessimistic. I just think of all the 18 fixtures left, this is one that just jumps out at me, you know, in terms of the red light, in terms of this is going to be a really difficult game in terms of the matchup between
especially
the two
for
sides.
A young squad as well. A young squad going to the Den. I hadn't considered that actually. It's quite a place, isn't it?
I honestly think this is one of the sort of 3 or 4 toughest games of the season left. Like you say, in terms of the lineup, I don't expect many changes at all. I think Dennis Serkin hopefully is getting quite close to coming back, but I don't think you're going to put him straight back in the team. I just don't see that. So yeah, I see it as a very, very similar team, probably with Geldhart in for Stewart. I don't think he's got any choice but just to say, right, go on, Joe, good luck, enjoy. Let's see what you're all about. And that is exciting. Listen, Geldhart's got a huge reputation in the game. And it is exciting to see how it goes.
And it's easy to forget that everybody was buzzing 7 days ago when he came in. It's soured with the Ross Stewart injury and the failure to get a striker. Geldhart in isolation is a good player. We know that.
It's a brilliant signing. It's an exciting signing. It was a real coup. Really good work from the club, from Tony Mowbray, from Speakman to get it done. And yeah, that is definitely something to look forward to. But I think I wouldn't be surprised if him for Stewart was literally the only change from the side that started last week. And like I say, my personal view, other people may disagree, my personal view is if you come away from that with a point, that's a solid afternoon, and you move on with optimism to the rest of your season. But fingers crossed they can produce it. We know that the good thing at the moment is that, you know, striker or no striker, you know that you're gonna have moments in the game with the way that Roberts and Ahmad are playing. Even when Clark's form dips, it's very, very rare that he goes to a game without having 2 or 3 really good moments. So yeah, it's exciting.
He had that moment against Fulham as well. He did really well to nick the ball and a good finish. Tom Gardner on Facebook says, Duncan Watmore, the curse of ex-players. Of course, he's just moved to Millwall to join former teammate at the Academy of Lights, George Honeyman as well, who's at Millwall. Leeds United's defender is at Millwall, Charlie Cresswell, the loanee who was linked heavily with Sunderland for the past 3 windows. So there's all these little lovely narratives which I'm sure will come good at some point. But Phil, once again, thank you for joining me. You can listen to the Raw podcast in all podcast places. It's now on Amazon Music as well if you want to have a little look over there. And you can, of course, head over to the Sunderland Echo. Essential reading from Phil on the transfer window. All of the fallout over the next couple of days. Tony Mowbray's press conference coming up tomorrow. All of the pre-Millwall and Fulham chat as well. But yeah, thank you once again for tuning in.